A few years back, the United Nations appointed the Islamic Republic of Iran as the Commission on the State of Women. In quotes, Iran, a terrorist regime that beats, blinds, arrests, tortures, rapes, and kills female protesters, as quoted by Hillel Noor, director of UN Watch. Is it time for all democracies and moral countries to cut ties with the United Nations and start anew? Or do you think they are salvageable?
There have been lots of attempts over the years to do something about the United Nations, and there were obviously moves in the 70s, there were moves in the 2000s to form something like a union of democracies or something like this. And the problems of the United Nations remain what they've been all of our lives. The problem is that it's a forum where the world's totalitarianisms get the pretense that they're the same as the world's democracies. As you say, I mean, the Human Rights Council is one of the worst offenders, and yes, of course, you end up in these just la-la land, no, Alice in Wonderland situations where, as you say, the Iranian revolutionary government chairs something on the status of women, and the North Korean government chairs the one on press freedom or whatever. And I mean, I enormously admire Hillel Noor as a friend, but I've often said I just don't know how you do it, because just being through the looking glass for so long in Geneva, it does something to people. But the problems of the UN remain the same, and the problem is always that what you would set up would be a UN-like organization. But one thing I would say can be done is that people can be educated about what the UN is not, you know. Okay, you have these votes, you have the endless resolutions against Israel and so on. Sure, okay. Just know that the game is rigged. You know, the famous joke is that the UN should have a soccer team. And the response is, yeah, but who would they play? Well, it's Israel, of course. You know, it's been rigged like this for decades. In 1975, when the Zionism is Racism resolution was passed at the United Nations, and Daniel Patrick Moylan, a great distinguished Democrat, gave that extraordinary speech of rebuttal. The motion was, among other things, put down by Idi Amin. Okay, Idi Amin apparently had the right to decide what racism was. A man who had the blood of more Ugandans on his hand than anyone else in recent memory. I once had a copy editor in an early book of mine say, when I mentioned Idi Amin, I think you've made a mistake here. You say that you describe Idi Amin as a wife eater. Surely there's a B missing. I said, oh no. Sadly not. But, you know, and when that resolution passed, the Zionism is Racism resolution, I mean, imagine what Idi Amin did to his country and his people. But the reception that night to celebrate the resolution passing was hosted by Kurt Waldheim of the SS. So my view is that since then, no one should take lessons in morality from the United Nations. But again, it's a question of particularly young people understanding that the UN is not what it pretends and claims to be. So when people say, you know, the United Nations has ruled on this, I think you have to understand its edict should not be regarded as universal or indeed moral.
Why are they hyper-focused on Israel? What is the obsession? More resolutions against Israel than every country on earth put together, including North Korea, fighters of freedom in Venezuela, Russia, China. How does this even happen?
Well, it's several reasons. I mean, one is that the Organization of the Islamic Conference is very important in the United Nations. It has dozens of countries at its beck and call, whereas Israel is the one Jewish state. Again, you've all seen the videos of people doing vox pops at campuses and so on, and asking students how many Jewish states are there, 1, 12, or 89, and they go, But I think it's like 26. A number you weren't even offered. Anyway, but of course, I mean, in simple numbers terms, Israel is vastly outnumbered at the United Nations. And you have the non-aligned countries. You have countries like South Africa that are easily bored. I mean, why did the South African government decide to do this? They didn't. The South African government can't keep the lights on in Johannesburg, okay? They have serious problems. Serious problems. Does anyone really think they were suddenly spurred to moral outrage about the Gazans? Of course not. The regime in Tehran paid them, recruited them, and got them to do the job. And so they acted as a proxy, one of the many proxies of Tehran. And I think that for that reason and many others, Israel will be at a disadvantage. One other thing that has to be said is, there's always there's a disconnect which the United Nations epitomizes, which is the disconnect between people you can speak to and who might listen, and people who will never listen. Some of you have probably had this experience in your lives, you can end up complaining most to the people nearest to you. You can end up treating harshest the people who are closest to you. Sometimes you're nice to strangers and not to the people around you. And in my view, the world's democracies have realized, Israel does listen. It does care. It does not want to be accused of a horrific crime like genocide. The North Korean government does not care and will not listen. And that creates a total difference in the way, it's the same with Israel and Hamas. You'd think from some people, including some Israelis, that the 130 remaining hostages are held in Benjamin Netanyahu's basement. I mean, I'm serious. It's all about the pressure to put on Netanyahu, the pressure to put on the Israelis. Why don't you put the pressure on Hamas? Because Hamas doesn't listen. And, I'll tell you a story off the record because we're in private. I have a friend who always says, I'm not indiscreet, it's the people I speak to. But I'll tell you a story off record. In November, I was at a meeting in the Knesset with the families of all of the children hostages, and some representatives from the government, and also some representatives from UNICEF. Now, UNICEF, as one of the parents pointed out, has one job, just to look after kids. And UNICEF was silent on the abduction of Jewish children. Silent. And when the head of UNICEF was meant to finally come to Jerusalem, she called in sick. And I discovered during the meeting, although I didn't say it to the parents, that she was actually in Gaza. And the deputy head, who she sent, sat there in front of these unimaginable, in front of these parents, and took notes occasionally and expressed sorrow. And they'd done nothing. And one of the reasons why they'd done nothing was because they presumably knew Hamas doesn't give a damn about UNICEF. The Israeli government does. The governments of most developed democracies do. You think you're going to persuade Hamas to do anything they don't want to do unless you force them? This is one of the problems we've all got into in the democracies. We've got into this mad situation where we berate our friends, and those who would want to kill us, we somehow keep out of the equation.